I'm David Raphael, and I'm the co-founder of the Jewish Grandparents Network. And in the light of what happened yesterday, we were wondering whether we should change the format of this evening or whether we should have it at all. And Ron said, we must go on. This is what we do. We will mourn, but at the same time, we will celebrate our time together and our families. So tonight, we're going to continue with we're going to move forward with the agenda as we've set. We're going to meet two extraordinary storytellers and educators and learn about their stories and then have an opportunity to ask them questions of your own. So we'll talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll take questions from the audience. To my left, I'm delighted to introduce Georgia's own, Atlanta's own Marshall Duke, who is Charles Howard Candler, a professor of psychology at Emory University and a core faculty member of the Emory Study of Myth and Ritual in American Life, and an active member of our Atlanta Jewish community. He has authored numerous books, including Teaching Your Children the Language of Social Success and Starting Kids Off Right, How to Raise Confident Children Who Make Friends and can make friends and build healthy relationships. Marshall's research, conducted in partnership with Robin Fivush and others, speaks of the importance of family narratives in promoting emotional stability in children. He teaches us that grandparents play an essential role in the sharing of these stories. To my right is a brand new friend of mine, and also a wonderful story. Ron Wolfson is the Fingerhut Professor of Education at American Jewish University and president of the Crippi Institute. He is among today's leading Jewish innovators and educators. He's the author of numerous books, including Relational Judaism, Using the Power of Relationships to Transform the Jewish Community, and God's To-Do List, 103 Ways to Be an Angel and to Do God's Work on Earth. In his wonderful, humorous memoir, The Best Boy in the United States of America, Dr. Wolfson shares the delightful stories, particularly with particular attention given to his grandparents. So, to start, Marshall and Ron, can each of you share a little bit of your stories?
Please, Marshall, go ahead.
My story. So can you hear me? Yeah. Yes? Okay. So I've been in Atlanta for 48 years, meaning I'm a Yankee. So this is Atlanta. This is the great historic building we're in. And I love the city and have been here for, as I said, almost half a century. And have been touched, actually, by what the Rabbi said about this place being so meaningful for tonight, since the temple bombing arguably was the last greatest terrible thing to happen specifically to the Jewish community in this country. And obviously what's happened in Pittsburgh is now being said to be the most terrible event ever in our history, happening in a Jewish setting. So my story, why am I sitting here, is that I have always been fascinated with Baba Mises, grandmother's stories.
Right.
I grew up with a grandmother who told me Baba Mises. I didn't know they were until I would recount to my parents something my grandmother said, and they would say, "It's a Baba Misa. It's a story, literally, that a grandmother tells." And the reason I became more recently interested in this is because of this project that David mentioned, which was an Emory program, which was entitled the Emory Center for the Study of Myth and Ritual in American Life. Myth and Ritual in American Life. And we were endowed by the Sloan Foundation to study the ways in which American families were being pulled apart by both mom and dad working and not being able to do the kinds of things that seemed to maintain families in past years. Much more difficult to be sort of like a close-knit nuclear family. More often what would happen is that families would sort of disband every morning, and everybody would go in different places, and then they would come together again at night. And we were interested in things that might be more centripetal, to use a physics term, things that hold things in rather than make them fly out. So we did a project for about 10 or 11 years, and I can talk about this in either 6 hours or 5 minutes. So I will do the 5-minute version. The 5-minute version is that we've found that the more children knew about their family history, the stronger they were, the more resilient they were, the less likely they were to get into trouble at school, to get into trouble with the law. They did better in their grades, in their schoolwork. There was something healthy about knowing the history of your family. And we began to study this. What about this? Knowing where you come from seems to build strength and resilience in children. And this brought us to the grandparents, because it turns out that the short answer to what makes children more resilient, knowing about their family history, comes down to how they learn about their family history. And the way they learn about their family history is that somebody tells them. If you think about it, you know, from the time, if anything you know from the time you were born and back is hearsay.
Oh.
It's just hearsay. It's not admissible in court. Okay? But it's hearsay. Somebody told you. And the one who tells, typically, in families is what the anthropologists call the kinkeeper, the grandmother. Every time I say that, usually a grandfather comes up after I give a talk and says, I tell stories. So, you know, depending on how big the person is, I usually agree. You know,
Put the mic closer.
grandparents are the ones who tend to tell the stories. They tell the stories over and over. They tell them in different circumstances. They tell them when needed. And the research that we did showed us that probably the best predictor of adjustment in kids, family functioning, all sorts of good things that I think we would seek to develop in our kids, the best predictor of this is how much they know about their families. So I know I'll talk more about this as we go on, because David has shown us some of the questions that he's going to ask. So we'll look surprised, but we won't be.
There'll be a test.
Okay, so that's how I come here, to be focused on grandchildren and grandparents as a really important pair in any family, and they're a very special pair. And I think we'll get into a little bit why they're so special as we go on.
Terrific. So my story begins in Omaha, Nebraska. My Zadie, my grandfather, came there in 1905 from Minsk, Gubernia, which means the county of Minsk. He was coming all the way across the world to chase after my grandmother. I called her Bubby. He had fallen in love with her back in Minsk, and she got passage first. So he came all the way after saving his kopecks to meet her in Omaha. They got married. They had 4 daughters. The baby was my mother. There were 9 grandchildren in the family, all living off of Zadie's fruit and vegetable stand that became the first modern supermarket in Nebraska. What made it modern? It was self-service aisles and a check stand. Before then, it was a general store where you went up to the counter. But Zadie created this store in 1955, and 5 families lived off that store. When we grandchildren, including me, would come over to Bubby and Zadie's house on Miami Street in Omaha, we would come through the back door through the kitchen, give Bubby a kiss, grab from an old white roaster a handful of Bubby's cookies. These were mandel bread studded with almonds dipped in cinnamon sugar. We called them Bubby's cookies. We'd munch on the cookies. We'd come around the corner to see Zadie. Zadie sat in a big red velvet chair in front of his big screen TV. Once he had a little money, he bought the biggest television he could. Next to his big red velvet chair was a side table that had 3 things on it. a pack of Camel cigarettes, unfiltered. He smoked 4 packs a day. There was a silver-plated Ronson lighter. I don't know if you remember those, but I still have it. It's the one thing I've inherited, well, the one physical thing I inherited from Zadie. And there was also, the third thing, a glass of water with his teeth in it. There was no ashtray. Where did Zadie put out the butts of his cigarettes? In his suit pocket, in the dash of his Cadillac, in the sides of the chair. How he didn't blow himself up, I have no idea. So now I'm coming around the corner and he sees me. And of course he immediately cried, because he cried at a drop of a hat. And he would open up his very big, strong legs, and I would jump into his lap, and he put me in a World Wrestling Federation leg lock. I would say, Zadie, I know, let me go. He wouldn't let me go till he said it again. Ronnie, you're the best boy in the United States of America. I say, Zadie, I know, let me go. Nope, third time. Ronnie, you're the best boy in the United States of America. And then finally he let me go and I would run off, feeling great. And then my brother Bobby would come around the corner. He would jump in Zadie's lap. Zadie would put him in a leg lock, look him in the eye, give him a big, wet, scratchy kiss, and he would say, Bobby, you're the best boy in the United States of America. And then my brother Dougie, you're the best boy in the United States of America. And he did this for every one of his grandchildren. Now, he wasn't saying to us, you are the best boy. He was really saying to us, be the best you can be. And we adored him. We adored him. Even though he didn't have great English, he didn't sign his name except with an X, but the memories of his love have sustained me all these years.
Cool. Marshall, I just want to get back to something you said. You used the term kinkeeper. I'm not sure. Tell me what that means, a kinkeeper.
Kinkeeper means the keeper of the family, keeper of the kin, the one who tells us where we've come from, the one who holds us together, the one who is the carrier of the information, but also the one who tells the stories, just as Ron says, and also is the one skilled in being able to tailor the story to whatever purpose there was. In other words, if a child has a problem in math, the grandmother might say, you know, your mother had a problem in math. And we'll then tell a story how the mother overcame this. But if Dougie comes in with a problem in English, she'll say, Dougie, you know, your mother had problems in English. And so this notion of saying the same thing to different kids, changing the story on the spot. In the research that we did, we found that people knew stories, and in one study that we did, we wanted to see whether or not they were accurate about the stories. What they said to us, I know about where my grandparents grew up, and I know some stories about my mother when she was a child, and we'd say, okay, well, what were they? And they'd tell us, and then we would actually ask their parents if the answer was correct, and it rarely was, because the stories were not true.
Right.
One thing so the Bubba Mice was real.
Right.
The stories are not true. Even if we ask sisters, siblings, aunts and uncles, they would have different stories about their very own parents.
Yeah.
They were convinced that certain things never happened. They were convinced that other things did happen.
Yeah.
And so in each family, there would be several stories about a particular event. It turned out that it didn't matter. It didn't matter. If the kids had a story that was compelling, reassuring, strengthening, that was what they needed. The accuracy was secondary. And doing it over and over. I love what Ron is saying about this, because they would say the same thing, and if they didn't know that we heard it over and over.
Yes.
Because my grandmother used to always wish me, when I left the house, she lived in our house on the lower floor, And every time we left, she would say something to me in Hungarian Yiddish, which is a very special language that I understood only because she was the only person in the world who used it. And she always said the same thing to me in Hungarian Yiddish. And it was essentially, go in health, come back in health.
Yes.
Have luck and blessing and forgiveness.
Geh gesund and komm gesund.
That's right.
Yeah.
Geh
Geh gesund.
A muzzle, sluck, and a bracha, and sluck, she would say. Something to that effect. And she would say it all the time. And I said, well, it's pretty special for me, you know. But then if I was leaving, or if my brother left first, he would get the same thing. And everybody who left the house would get it. And I thought I was the only one, for example, who got the message that, that I had to do really well in school, because if I didn't, then they would put it in the newspaper. It's true. See, I believed it. So I had to be the best boy.
They had to be the best.
I actually read that article.
What's the newspaper?
The grandparent, the kin keepers, they feel that this is their place, and I think it is their place, by the way. I think that parents don't have the same ability to tell the stories that the grandparents can tell, because there's a special connection between the grandchildren and the grandparents.
So I hear you saying something very powerful. Your research talks about the importance of stories in promoting emotional resilience in children, but you're also saying that stories play an essential role in sustaining our families and nurturing our families, and that the grandparents, the grandmothers, play a core role in that.
Yes, the sense of continuity that comes with the story is really important in the establishment of resilience, because continuity means there's a connection between what's happening now and what happened years ago, and that means there's a connection between what's happening now and what's going to happen.
Got it.
If there's a continuity, that means that what happened in the past is likely to happen again. And so if something bad is happening now, I know that in my family's story there were bad things, but then there have been mostly good things, and now here's a bad thing, but I can probably bet there's going to be a good thing.
Right.
And so this notion that we found is something that we called an oscillating family narrative. The idea that good things happen in families and bad things happen in families, and if kids know about all of those things, as the rabbi said, we won't be destroyed. We weren't destroyed before. We won't be destroyed again.
Yeah.
That's the narrative, and that's the Jewish narrative.
Right.
It's a very long one, but that's what builds the resilience. You have to tell the story, build the narrative, but the narrative maintains the resilience.
Huh.
So, Ron, among your more recent efforts has been in the area of relational Judaism,
Yeah.
and the importance of relational Judaism in advancing our community. So you wrote a book, Relational Judaism, Using the Power of Relationships to Transform the Jewish Community. And in that book you wrote, our starting point is an amalgam of two of the fundamental and most beloved activities that define the Jewish experience: telling stories and asking questions. Building relationships begin by engaging in conversation and sharing our stories. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, let's talk about what it means for grandparents. I would reverse it. In other words, I think we ought to be encouraging, and I think it's natural, that grandchildren ask questions. So they're built for asking questions. Why do you do this, Zadie? Why do you do this, Bubby, Grandma, Gramsy? Whatever you're called. The kids are natural question askers, as are most of us who are in the Jewish persuasion. Then I think it's our job to tell the stories that illustrate the answers to the questions. So, for example, I was in a home where a grandchild asked the grandmother, "Why do you do this, Grandma, around the Shabbat candles?" And it reminded me of my own grandmother. I should give you a Bubby story as well as a Zadie story. So my Bubby, brought with her from Russia her Jewish traditions. And one of them was lighting Shabbat candles. So she would go all by herself. All these grandchildren are running around and aunts and uncles. And she'd go all by herself in those days to the dining room where her table was set. But next to the table was a break front. You know, remember what a break front was? It was like this big piece of furniture with her china and silver and stuff. On it was her candelabrum for Shabbat candles. So I would watch this as a little boy. I'd be fascinated. She put up the candles. She put a little scarf on her head, which is the female equivalent of a kippah. It was called what did you call it? A tichel. And then she'd stand up, and she'd light the candles. Is that okay if I can stand? Okay. And then she did what to me is like a 6-year-old boy, the strangest thing, most mysterious thing I'd ever seen. She went like this 3 times around the candles, and she'd end up like this, blocking her side of the candles. She'd start a little aerobics, a little shuckling, and she would be saying the blessing under her breath, L'ad like Ner Shel Shabbos. And then what seemed like forever was just a minute or two. She kept going, and I never knew what was happening under these hands. But when she stopped, finally, she opened her eyes, she gazed at the candles, and every single Friday night I saw her do this, there were tears streaming down her face. A little boy, a little grandson, I had no idea why she was crying till much later. She was crying because she didn't go to the synagogue. But this was her private moment with God. This is to ask for the blessings of God for her family and for her friends and her community. And then, this is the most important part of the story, she would go from all this ritual that was all by herself, she'd run into the living room where the grandchildren were running around. She'd grab the first one she could get her hands on. Often it was me. And she'd plant another big, wet, scratchy kiss. Hers was scratchy because she had a mole with a little hair sticking up right here. And she would say, Good Shabbos, Tatale. Good Shabbos, Tatale. Now, my friend Harlene Appelman is one of the great Jewish family educators in the world, and I would share these stories, and I'd say, that's the moment I learned that it's not just about the blessings, it's about the blessings and the kisses. So I'll never forget my grandmother's kiss. And now today, when I teach, and people wonder what she was doing with this. I mean, I was like, one more minute? I saw a woman light candles, and she would like this, like a chicken. She was going, I wrote, my first book was a 260-page book about Shabbat dinners and ritual, and I never heard anybody going, when she did this 3 times around the cat. So finally, I went up to her. She grew up in a traditional home. I said, listen, tell me, what was that you were saying when you blessed the candle? You said something like, she looked at me, a graduate of law school, and said, I don't know. So I said, wait a minute. Then why are you doing it? And she said, my mother lit candles that way. My grandmother lit candles that way. This is where storytelling doesn't work. So I said, well, slow it down. And she says, Barich Shemeh. So that's a contraction of something we sing in the synagogue, traditional synagogues, Baruch atah Hashem, praise to you, God. And the congregation is supposed to say, Baruch Hu u'Baruch Shemo. Praises God and praises God's name. I don't know about your synagogue. Mine, everyone's in a hurry. So it comes out Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo. I was in one synagogue when I Baruch Shemo. I was in one in Minneapolis where everyone was going Shmo. They're talking about the rabbi, the cantor, the president, I don't know. So somewhere in this woman's tradition, and she was a young mom, she had done this over the years. I mean, really, it started as a lovely tradition. Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo. Her bubby probably said Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, but it turned into bitch me. So I tell the story in order for people to understand the power of story, because that's a story that tells volumes. So blessings and kisses, and figure out why you're saying what you're saying. And then tell your grandchildren.
I think my grandmother had the same mole.
She had the same mole?
Yeah. Maybe they all did, I
I
don't
think
know.
mine did too. I think.
So that's the beginning of relationship building. That was your question.
Well, I actually I have a follow-up question for that, because in your
Okay.
book, The Best Boy in the United States, and by the way, your grandfather told me that was really your brother
It was my brother
who is the best boy.
and my other brother.
That's right, the other brother. But you wrote in the book, little did I realize at the time that the traditions of my Zadie and Bubby, our extended family, and my mom and dad would profoundly shape my worldview.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And clearly they have. But tell us a little bit about the worldview that has emerged from those traditions.
So I learned from my Zadie, who was this grocer, that every human being is made in the image of God, and every customer who walked into a store, whatever their race, religion, or creed, or color, was treated that way. And that certainly shaped my worldview. My grandfather loved baseball, so he bought the box behind home plate. And the Omaha Cardinals was a AAA team. And he used to take us there. And then he loved wrestling matches. He would take us to the Omaha Civic Auditorium. I'm really focused in my worldview on giving this, my grandchildren don't live near us. So whenever we're together, I want to help create experiences with them that are memorable, that they will remember, because that's what I remember from my grandparents. And I think that worldview has put me in good stead. They were great role models, family above everything. Talking about telling stories, all 9 of us grandchildren were banished to the basement of Bubby and Zadie's house after a Passover Seder. So the adults, including my grandparents, could sit and tell stories over their Maxwell House coffee and their macaroons. And they would talk forever until Lori, the one girl in the group, ended up bleeding. And then the evening would end when she was taken to the emergency room for stitches, because all these boys would play a game called War, and Lori was the ball.
Oh,
so
nice.
But I would watch them tell stories, and I realized that's another thing that's so powerful at family events, to shape the time so the stories can be told. And they're often very funny, I remember them laughing hysterically. And, I don't know about in your family. My family, it was always phone calls. My mother used to do this, may she rest in peace. She used to call and tell she couldn't wait to hear the stories of our children. And I couldn't wait to hear her stories about her life and what was going on. So I think this notion of my worldview of the importance of stories is absolutely critical. And my colleagues here who know me for a few years, looking at Paul, know that whenever I teach, I tell stories. And I'll bet Marshall's the same way. Mm-hmm. You tell stories, you engage your audience, whether it's a group of people at a conference or it's your own grandchildren.
So actually, Marshall, I want to, Ron's comment reminds, kind of made me think of something you said. You wrote in 2013, you wrote a piece in the Huffington Post. It is not the content of what is known that is the critical factor, but the process by which these things came to be known. In order to hear family stories, people need to sit down with one another and not be distracted. Some people have to talk, and some have to listen. The stories need to be told over and over, and the times of sitting together needs to be multiplied and occur over many years. Can you talk about that process a little bit and the grandparents' role in it?
Yeah, it says what I wanted to say there, and that is essentially that the content is secondary to the process of it. That is, what we lose very often is the awareness that when the stories are told, you're sitting with somebody, and it's your grandmother, and sometimes you're on a lap, and sometimes you're at a dinner table, and sometimes you're on a vacation, and sometimes you're in places that are really fun to be. And so what happens is that you actually experience a story content-wise, but the thing that makes you remember it is more where you were, who you were with, the fact that this person has expressed this idea over and over and over, and just as you're saying, you're the best boy, over and over and over. And it's not so much what's in the story, because it's easy to remember a story. I mean, you can remember content fairly quickly. But why does it take so many years to establish the emotional impact is because of the warmth of the person that you're with, the love that comes with it, the fun that happens. That's part of the process. So it's the package that it comes in. So in other words, I couldn't give my grandchildren, even though it's a good idea, just a plain written note telling the story. I wouldn't have the same impact. I have my grandchild over here, and I say, well, here's the story of how your mother got in trouble at school with the principal. There it is. Okay, fine. That would it wouldn't have the same impact, right, because it's the process. It's how it happens. And who knows which is more important. I think they're both very important, and I don't think we can separate them. But I do know if you take out the teller, that the story doesn't have the same impact.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that question, and this wasn't in the list, so I apologize. But, you know, we grew up at a time when we all lived around the block. From our children and our, my grandparents were at our house every day, and we visited my other grandparents once a week, and all of our aunts and uncles lived nearby. And so that process, that time together, certainly was kind of easier and happened on a more regular basis. Well, I would say if we asked the question of the grandparents in the room, how many have grandchildren who live far away, kind of the majority of us would raise their hands.
Yeah.
So in the context of what Lee and I call the new Jewish family, of distances, multi-faith families, and changing family dynamic, how does that dynamic of that time together change and shift, and how can we think about adjusting our thinking to continue that important work?
Marshall?
So as the rabbi says at the end of
the mic a little bit.
Yeah.
It's hard for people to hear.
You okay?
Can you hold it?
No. The rabbi says at the end of Fiddler on the Roof, we'll have to wait for the Mashiach somewhere else. We're going to have to do it a different way. We certainly would like to continue having these experiences, and as many times as possible, making the memories. It's a great way to think about it. I think we try and do that. And sometimes grandparents do crazy things to make memories.
Yeah.
You do things a little bit in an odd way to make a memory. And if you only have 4 days, then these 4 days might have to be a little bit crazier than usual.
That's not
However,
hard for me.
we have technology. So we've got people visiting on Skype and visiting on Zoom and FaceTime and all these other kinds of things. We have to adapt to that technology. And do the best we can with it. I think the voices, faces, you can't replace the touch, but you can hear a voice, and you can see a face, and you can see a smile, and you can hear a laugh, and you can do all these kinds of things with technology. No, I haven't any data to show that that's going to be as good as a lap, but it's definitely better than like a telegram.
What? What's a telegram? I think, before the advent of personal phones, when you could FaceTime easily with your grandchildren, those moments of being together were really critical. And I don't know I know one of the questions you asked us was, are there other ways to share stories besides speaking? And so I want to share with you one that I think relates to your question. My wife is known as Bubby. She has a very proud pin she likes to wear. It says Bubby. And on our recent visit with them in Northern California, I live in Los Angeles, Susie offered the opportunity to her 7-year-old granddaughter, to make matzo balls. And she used, and Ellie, the granddaughter, loved this idea. So I could show you later pictures of them making matzo balls. And Susie used her family cookbook that she put together before you could do all this online. This is a 300-page or so family cookbook that has recipes. She calls it Recipes for Memories. And what she did is she collected the recipes of dishes that our children grew up with, so that they could remember the foods that we served them. And now it's going to the next generation, because she used this cookbook to make matzo balls with Ellie. And the best page in this book, I just have to share this with you. And there's stories about each recipe. And one of the pages has my mother's borscht recipe in her own handwriting. You know, and there are pictures of the people whose recipes Susie collected. I mean, if, God forbid, if there was a fire in our house, this is what I would grab to take home, to take out. So this page is called Dueling Matzo Balls. Because my mother, Bubby W. from the Russian stock, made big, fluffy matzo balls that floated in the soup. Do we have any fluffers in the room? Can I just see? Okay, but Susie's father was from Poland, and he made sinkers. He made little golf ball-sized matzo balls. Any sinkers in the room? Okay. He used to leave them on the counter overnight to get hard. And so Susie put on one page Bubby K's, Zadie Kukovka's recipe for matzo ball, the sinkers, and Bubby W's, the fluffers. And she made 3 copies of this. We have one. One we gave to Javi, our daughter, who just read it and wept. You know, she just couldn't believe it. And then we took gave one to our son Michael, who was 27 at the time, not involved in Jewish life at all. And she was really worried about his reaction. But he read every word on every page and said, "Mom, thank you, this is my life." And the next Passover, he couldn't come for Seder, so Susie sent him a care package with all the stuff to make Seder, including a box of matzo ball mix. Hoping against hope he would make a Seder with his friends. So he called the next day and said, "Mom, thanks for the care package for Seder. I made a Seder with my friends. I made matzo balls, and I used your cookbook." And Susie was thrilled. There's another way to share a story, because the story is really about my mother, his grandmother, and his grandfather, right? So Susie couldn't wait to ask him, "Which recipe did you use? And how did they come out?" So my son Michael said, "Well, I was going for Bubby, but they came out Zadie." So I think it's you're welcome to look at this later. It's just a remarkable way to share our stories, beyond just the telling of the story or the writing of a story. But this is the story of our family.
So we're going to go for about another 10 or 15 minutes. And I want to stop now to see whether anybody in the audience would like to ask a question before I ask other questions. Okay. No one? I do. Okay.
So when you think about the oscillating narrative, how does this relate to our Jewish stories, the wonderful Genesis stories that we have, and what role might grandparents have with that, and how do we use those?
Well, so a good question, and yes, we are an oscillating people. You know. The grandest telling of a story, which involves all the people being involved at the same time or being sitting together at the same time, is the Passover Seder, as Ron says, and it's probably, if I remember right, the single most frequently celebrated ritual in all of Judaism. It's the telling of the story. It's the people's story. And that story is marked by up, down, up, down, up, down. And it is a model story for survival of a people, which can absorb the kinds of terrible things that happen and keep going. And I think that just you write that smaller and you get to a family which has a story of ups and downs. And often we worry about telling children stories that are negative, bad stories, and a lot of families don't tell the children the sad stories in their history or the bad things that happened. Of course, this takes good judgment, but at different points in their life, most children can hear most of the things that have happened. And it turns out that in our research that the families that told negative stories as well as positive stories were stronger. These kinds of things.
I would agree, and just to give one example, Jacob is on his deathbed, and he calls his 2 grandchildren over and says to them, directly quoting the Torah, Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chi Menashe. May you be like Ephraim and Menashe. Now he's saying that to Ephraim and Menashe. So it really doesn't make sense, right? I mean, may you be like Ephraim and Menashe. But if you remember, Jacob, his name is changed to Yisrael, the one who wrestles with God. So my little interpretation of this moment of a grandparent blessing his grandchildren is to think about the future of the family, the path that God has laid out for you. And it's a beautiful moment in the Torah story. So, that we ought to look in this project, Lee, and David, and can we give them a mazel tov on this wonderful idea? Can we find those stories in Jewish tradition about grandparents not just telling stories to their grandchildren, but blessings and by the way, speaking of resilience, we got a heck of a story of resilience in the Torah with all the things we went through. So it's a very powerful idea.
Rich, you had a question?
I have so many questions, but I'll limit it to one. What are some of your favorite questions? What are some of the questions that you think get at some of the most rich and important types of information? What do you like?
You mean questions that we...
Of grandchildren to grandparents?
What are, in the dynamic of family relationships, and
Oh.
storytelling and asking questions, what are some of, I think as a society we are losing our storytelling skill sets, and that's a whole conversation. But so in that, with that context, what are the questions that you think get to the heart of some of the stories that need to be preserved and shared? What are some of your top 3, those types of things?
You want to take a shot?
No,
I can tell you some of the
Some that
questions
you
that
learned.
we use are always questions that the child could not know the answer to through personal experience. So it has to be something like, do you know where your grandfather grew up? Do you know what business he was in? Do you know where he went to school? Some of the things he used to do? Know something funny that happened to your grandmother? You know anything that happened on the day your parents were married? Where there are stories, in other words. Because there are always stories about weddings and births and things that the child couldn't know.
Good.
And that's how we know that somebody has sat down and told them the stories. And it's hard to get at a child's mind. You can ask all kinds of interesting questions about, what would your great-grandmother have done in this situation? You can ask interesting questions like that. They get a little bit more complicated. But I think, and sometimes when we put out our set of 20 questions that we kind of generated, all questions that kids could not know the answers to. And the first time we had any publicity on that, somebody from Parents Magazine called and says, tell us what the 20 things are that kids need to know in order to be resilient. Okay, what are the 20 things? I'll just, we'll teach the kids. It's like the marshmallow test, that people say, well, I'm going to teach my child not to eat the marshmallow, and that's going to make the child more capable. it's confusing correlation with causation, and so what we said is, look, it's not the content of what they know, is how they got to know it,
Right.
and you can make up your own questions, and we always encourage people to make up their own questions about their families, whatever they want to ask, so long as the rule is followed, that they could not know this unless somebody told them. And those are always good questions. But I really also like questions that go to what would so-and-so have done, and to present sort of interesting or difficult questions. There's one wonderful story that just comes to my mind, and I really like it, so I want to tell you about.
Okay, good.
It's this experiment where people are looking at when kids develop a notion of God and whether there is a sense of what God is about. And they're asking these 5-year-old kids. And there's a special task that we use which has to do with theory of mind. When do kids develop the ability to be able to know what's going on in somebody else's head? And so they bring this child in, and they have a crayon box, a little yellow Crayola box. And in the box there's secretly a bunch of little pebbles. And they say to the child, "What's in the box?" And the child says, "Crayons." And they dump it, and they say, "No, it's not crayons, it's pebbles." Okay, and the child goes, And they put the pebbles back in the box, and they close it up, and another child is waiting at the door, and they say, "When that child comes in, and I'm going to show him the box, what is he going to say is in the box?" And the child says, "Crayons. Even though I know it's pebbles." Okay, that's good. It means the child developed a theory of other people's minds. I can know one thing and know you know something else. But wait. They then say to the child, "God is going to come into the room. And I'm going to ask God what's in the box. What's God going to say?" And the child says, "Pebbles."
Very good.
See? It's a very fundamental notion of God.
Yes.
It's really cool.
Beautiful.
Really a cool experiment.
That's great.
Beautiful.
I want to ask one closing question for Ron and Marshall. So if each of you could give one recommendation for grandparents about sharing stories, about how to share stories with their grandchildren or their children, what would that one recommendation be?
Marshall, please.
They're very quick and easy. Tell them the story as many times as necessary in order to get them to roll their eyes upward when you begin to tell it again.
That's once for my children.
Because that means that they know it.
That's right.
They know it. If they go, "Oh, here it comes." When you see that sign, you say, "I'm a
You've
good
done it.
grandparent."
Yeah, that's very good.
That's great.
I'm close to that with my grandson. His name is Gabriel Elijah. And there was a Brit Milah, there was a bris, a circumcision ceremony today at the temple. So I will tell you just quickly about Gabriel's Brit Milah, his circumcision. And this is a story I've now told him many times, and now he gets it. He's 5, and he starts to roll his eyes. I was honored to be the sandak at the Brit Milah of my grandson. That's the traditional role of usually a grandparent who holds the baby during the circumcision. So I was very honored to be asked, and I'm holding the baby, 8 days old, in my arms on an Elijah's chair, and I have a talit over my shoulders, prayer shawl over my shoulders, and this was, you can imagine, if any of you know a little Yiddish, I was verklempt the whole time. I was crying like a baby. And Javi, our daughter, has gotten from Susie, my wife, Bubby, Susie, a tremendous creativity when it comes to Jewish ritual. So I don't know how long the Brit Milah ceremonies you've been to are, but typically they're about 10 minutes. Javi concocted a 45-minute Brit Milah ceremony, and the moil, the circumciser, the service began with him doing the deed. And I'm holding the baby, and the baby did fine. You know, he put the gauze pad, you know, with the wine in the baby's mouth. It was great. The baby was very happy. And then came another 40 minutes of readings, songs, the explanation of Gabriel Elijah's names. Different family members had parts. I mean, this went on and on and on, and I'm still holding the baby. So finally, at 45 minutes, this is the part Gabe loves me to tell. It's over. And everybody starts singing. Please join me. Simon Tov and Mazel Tov, and Simon Tov, Simon Tov and Mazel Tov, and Simon. I don't know what came over me, but this is a true story. All my stories are true. I'm still holding the baby.
Start clapping.
I got up from the chair, holding the baby. I lifted him high over my head, and I screamed, Hakuna Matata! Did you see the line?
Yeah, sure.
This is the story I tell, and Gabe's eyes roll in his head because he saw the Lion King.
Well, I
He's
think
our prince.
that's a lovely ending. Ron and Marshall, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming.
Can I just I brought some books for you. This is my little memoir, which is another way to tell your stories. If you ever get a chance, even if it's not published, to write down the stories of your parents and grandparents and so on, it's a lovely thing to do. I think I have enough for everybody. It's a gift from me to you for coming tonight. So please come on. I'm happy to sign on. I think you'll get a kick out of the stories. So, and again, let's thank David and Marshall and everybody. Thank you. Love you.
Very nice.
Beautiful.
Ron, wonderful.
Wonderful.
Well,
Lot of fun.
Hey.
You're welcome to take a look at this.